CNBC TV18 Budget Town Hall. I'm Shereen Bhan. We've been decoding the budget fine print for you since the budget was unveiled by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, her 7th consecutive budget. We are now joined by captains of industry to talk about the impact and the implications. A power-packed panel: Sanjeev Mehta, Executive Chairman of L Catterton India, the former MD and CEO of HUL, Anish Shah, the President of FICCI and the CEO of Mahindra Group, Shereen Bhan, the CEO of Standard Chartered India, the President of ASSOCHAM, Sanjay Nair, with us, also Sanjeev Krishnan, the Chairperson of PwC in India. Gentlemen and Shereen, many thanks for joining us here on the CNBC TV18 Budget Town Hall. Sanjeev Mehta, first to you. A long speech, given the fact that the interim budget was barely 56 minutes. There's many changes. The priorities and the thrust areas remain similar to what we've seen announced by the Finance Minister in her previous budgets. What would your first take be on the impact of this budget, what it can do?
Before I talk about what the impact will be, let us take a step back and see where India is today. Yeah, if we compare India pre-COVID to where we are now, we have grown our economy by 20%.
Yeah.
And it's only India and China which have done that. Look at UK or France, they are just 2% above pre-COVID. Or look at developing country like Thailand, which is at the same level as pre-COVID. So we have done remarkably well. And in the last 3 years, growing upwards of 8% has been phenomenal. The second bit has been, look at the last big crisis, the global financial crisis. When the Fed said taper, rupee crashed. Today we are talking about a scenario where we have over $650 billion, which can cover our external debt. Our inflation today has been contained, and it is lower than many developed countries. So we are at a great position of strength. And from there, if we look at, I think what Madam Finance Minister has done, looked at certain structural issues, and she's tried to bring about a change. Let me talk about the biggest challenge that we face today. 60% of India lives in rural areas. 45% of the working population is in agri sector. And agri sector contributes 17% to the GDP, which is growing at about 1.5%. And even if you look at a past 30-year period, the agri sector growth has been at half the rate of the country's GDP. That's a non-sustainable. So what Madam Finance Minister, if you look at the thrust area, she has put in huge emphasis on agriculture. Earmarked about 1.5 lakh crore. The second important bit is, the other aspect that I would say is soft. You look at the private consumption, which has grown at about 4%. Whereas from the demand perspective, if you look at, they've grown at services at 7%, industry at about 9%. So that again is an area of concern. So what she's looked at, if I were to pick up from a manufacturing perspective, she's saying India is going to have multiple strategies. We need manufacturing, which is labor intensive. At the same time, she's very clear, we have to go up the value chain. So there is an enhanced focus on R&D and innovation. Whether you talk about modular and small nuclear reactors, or you talk about bringing in technology, digital public infrastructure in agriculture, or very importantly, the 1 lakh crore that was articulated during the interim budget. And now Madam Finance Minister is saying, yes, we are going to be led by the private sector. We must accept that India has to become a product nation. And India is not an either-or strategy, which often gets debated. We have to grow our agri sector. We have to grow our manufacturing.
And we have to grow services.
And services, if you look ahead, it will be impacted by AI. So we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to ring-fence services? So if you look at those 9 thrust areas, of course, a lot of them will be based on the policy that gets articulated later on. they're absolutely bang on. That's what the country needs today.
Well, yeah, the intent, I think, is the point that you make is taken. The question now is one of execution, and many of these schemes will be in different phases of how quickly they will start to result in impact. Yeah.
Shereen, let me give you one very interesting statistics. Go back to 2019-20. Our total capex, including the outlay that you have grants that go for capital, was 5 lakh crore. Today we are talking about the 7 ones plus 3 odd lakh crore, that totals up to 15 lakh crore. It's gone up 3x.
Yeah.
Now the interesting bit is, in 2019-20, the total tax collection was 13 lakh crore. Today we are talking about 26 lakh crore. So out of the delta 13 lakh crore, the government is putting 10 lakh crore in capex. Which is the right way to do.
Yeah.
That's a productive expenditure. Rather than putting it under revenue heads or under administration of the government, which would not have yielded the kind of benefits it has yielded and it will yield in the future.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I'm very pleased with the thrust areas of the government.
Well, pleased with the thrust areas of the government. That's the first word in from Sanjeev Mehta. I have many more questions for you, but let me get Anish Shah into the conversation as well. Anish, you've been with us through the course of the day, analyzing what the budget has been able to deliver on. And, you know, to take forward what Sanjeev Mehta was saying, we find ourselves in a position of strength. Many are calling it India's sweet spot. You know, in terms of both investment as well as consumption, Anish, does it really make a significant difference, or do you believe that the kind of growth momentum we were already seeing, that will only be further bolstered by the measures taken?
Shereen, the growth momentum that we've seen has been the result of a number of actions that have been taken. And Sanjeev mentioned the capex that we had seen in 2019 and the growth we've seen in that time period. If we just take last year's budget, it had a 34% growth in capex. So those actions have helped us get that momentum. And budget is always a tricky exercise because everyone wants everything. And as we've gone through today and done a detailed look at even the fine print, I'd say this is a very impressive budget. An impressive one because it manages to address a very large number of issues and keeps us on that path, on that momentum that we have achieved already by maintaining capex at a reasonably high level of 3.4% of GDP. Also, as Sanjeev said, you've taken literally the 10 lakh crore extra that has come in to fund capex because it has a greater multiplier effect. It has focused on agriculture. It is inclusive in many ways, having addressed the needs of women, farmers, the poor, the youth. Job and skilling is a significant focus for the budget, and technology. So a large number of areas have been looked at while maintaining fiscal discipline and getting to 4.9%, which is a tough act and has been done extremely well.
Yeah, Shereen, let me come to you now with some of the other changes that came in, and many changes this time around on the tax front. I think the long-term capital gains tax changes, people were hoping that it wouldn't be the case, but it has happened. And of course, the changes that have happened with respect to doing away with the indexation benefits, that certainly has many concerns, especially from the real estate sector's perspective. Other changes as well, you know, the angel tax being abolished, the equalization levy being done away with, the corporate tax cut for foreign companies in India. Zareen, on balance, the tax announcements, what's your big takeaway on the impact?
I would say, Shereen, that, you know, I heard some of the conversations with Mr. Somnathan, etc. Actually, you know, 20% coming to 12.5% to some extent takes care of the indexation sort of, you know, benefit being taken away. On foreign companies, tax coming down actually in September 19, when the tax was reduced from 30% to 22%, for foreign companies, it did not come down. So there was an 18% gap between foreign companies and domestic companies if you exclude the surcharges. So to that extent, I think this gap has been to some extent narrowed. That is what I would say. And frankly, the real estate momentum continues. If we see H1 this year, we've had 35 million square feet of residential sales. To my mind, that momentum is going to continue. Also, one other point, while we are talking of fiscal prudence, I think the fiscal deficit coming to 4.9%, government borrowing will be lesser. With the JP Morgan index inclusion, what we'll see is less of, there'll be a good amount of demand for government paper, and that will bring down interest rates for sure. So this, to my mind, is a very big positive of lower fiscal deficit and index inclusion coming around the same time.
Yeah, that fiscal deficit number being brought down to 4.9% and then 4.5% for the next year. Sanjay Nair, what do you like from what the finance minister has delivered with Budget 2024?
Not being populist, they could have used that 2.3 lakh dividend and they could have stuck to 5.1 and they could have splurged. So I think it's a pretty bold budget from a political point of view of taking the long, arduous route of creating jobs. Well, first the MSMEs, the environment, the jobs, and then the core sustainable income of the people, which will drive consumption. So I think it's the right way to do it. I actually didn't think that was going to happen. So I'm pleasantly surprised. As a result, I think you're sitting with a pretty strong balance sheet at a country level. I still agree. I still think total debt to GDP is high. Deficit is going down, but the total debt is still high. I think these next 6 months, Shereen, for the next budget, we can look for a lot of things, but I think simplification of life, as defined by simplification of taxes, TDSs, GST, the IT review of 1961, if all that can get done in 6 months, I think you begin to crowd in, as we have spoken earlier, crowd in the private investments and the private capex, and that's where the SMEs begin to come in. So frankly, you've got a pretty good, after 2-3 years after COVID, this country has a very solid balance sheet. It can get even better. And frankly, they can't do anything more than this with a balance sheet, which is where it is. I think the final thing is they're crowding and saving. I think Shereen just said the way they have tackled the deficit, and hopefully they borrow lesser or same as last year. Of course, leaving the contingencies on geopolitical crisis. You will automatically have a more attractive rate structure. So, private sector in India cannot have a better cost of capital environment with underlevered balance sheet, booming capital markets. So I think it's got to be really the ease of doing business, the cost of doing business, and the consumption capex gap has to begin to bridge. And frankly, it's not only the government's job to do this, right? Even jobs and skilling, they have put it back into the private sector's code and said, look, here is some PLI kind of thing. You guys always react to incentives. So we'll go hire people and skill them accordingly. So I think it's a pretty well thought out budget. I think it was better than I thought because it is not populist at all. And, but having said that, maybe we'll talk later, but I think there is still things to do to reduce the total debt to GDP. There's enough to monetize out there. And, we have spoken about that before, and maybe we'll pick it up later.
Yeah, and miscellaneous receipts, 50,000 crore rupees, that is what has been provisioned for in the interim budget and now in this budget as well. 6 months later, we've just come off a budget. We did a budget 5 months ago. We're doing a budget today, and another 6 months, we're going to do another budget. It is, I don't want to think about that just yet. Let me welcome Ratin Roy into the conversation as well. Ratin, thanks very much for joining us. I'm coming to you in just a second. Sanjeev, your take from the many announcements that came in significantly, the impact as far as the moves on FDI, or at least the intent to move further on FDI, as well as what they've been able to do to get rid of some of the pain points for the VCP community.
Shereen, I think first of all, I just want to say that we've been discussing the 4.9 I think it's eminently achievable. I think they've been very, very conservative, both in terms of their revenue collections, particularly on GST. If you compare it with the interim budget to what they've budgeted now, I think they were estimated lower. I think even the denominator is, I would have expected it to be higher because there is inflation. So I think it's eminently achievable. But for some of the stuff that they have, for expedient reasons, put in the budget, the 4.9% I think is eminently achievable, and it sets us on a very good fiscal path. I think some of the things that you mentioned, I think that taking away, for instance, of the angel taxation, I think it was possibly not, to the best of my mind, not creating a huge amount of tax revenues, but it was being too litigious in minds of many. And of course, it's about desirability, about India as an investment destination. So I think that was, to me, a very critical step. I think the two issues which we have been talking about, particularly employment generation, I think that's something which has been addressed in a very significant way by all the effort that has gone in terms of skilling, etc. And in a way, for some of the large corporations, in fact, there is an ask is to walk the talk, and I think it's a very, very good one. Whether you look at the GCC story, which requires significant skilling efforts, because now we're moving from cost arbitrage to really doing some value accretive work. I think the whole skilling gap, bridging the skilling gap, will hopefully create significant employment. And of course, with the MSME, a bunch of norms, a bunch of things that have come on for the MSMEs in terms of credit lines and others, I think it will certainly help, because the question really was that I'm willing to invest, but does India have the supply chain to be able to make sure that I can create sustained scaled businesses over a period of time? And I think that's something which has come through. I think on the ease of doing business, I completely agree with Sanjay. I think there is some more work to be done, but even steps that have been taken today, including how do you, let's say, shutting down an LLP if you so wish on a voluntary basis, the whole scheme about coming up with variable companies, capital companies. I think these are very good steps, and many possibly present in many other parts of the world. So I think these will again be significant incremental incentivization. They spoke about FDI, and I think that they've spoken about declogging the FDI piece as well. I didn't see anything very significant on the FDI pieces, but I think just making India easier to do business and making sure that there is
and the measures, the specific measures are yet to be rolled out. The intent is to roll those out, and we did have the Economic Affairs Secretary give us an indication or a glimpse of what the government is thinking at this point in time. I'll come back to you in just a second, Sanjeev, but let me bring Ratin into the conversation. You've obviously pored over the fine print, Ratin, and pored over the numbers in specific. So your first take on Budget 2024.
Well, I have three, I think, headlines for this budget. It's a prudent budget, it's a do-nothing budget, and it's a highly political, survival-oriented budget.
Okay. Now that the headlines are out of the way, and I know that there's going to be lots of chatter about those headlines, but let's pick up on each one of those. So prudent, because you believe that the fiscal math is credible, it's realistic, and they haven't done much as far as welfareism and populism, which was the expectation.
Oh, no, it's not that at all. The fiscal math is so realistic. It has been realistic since 2016, Shereen. As I probably say here every year, the central government has been shrinking to pay for fiscal consolidation. And even this year, the expenditure GDP ratio has actually fallen by 0.3% as of last year. It has fallen every year, and so far since about 2016, excluding COVID, when it had to rise, it's fallen by about 3-4%. And so fiscal consolidation happens when the government spends less as a proportion of GDP. Now in the budget numbers, they talk about lakhs of crores, it confuses everybody. But in terms of ratio of GDP, it has fallen. What is good this year is that there's a modest increase in the revenue GDP ratio, which is more than, remember I said revenue GDP ratio, we'll come back to that, not tax GDP ratio, which is enough with the cut in the expenditure GDP ratio to pay for this rather large fiscal deficit consolidation of 0.7. So as long as they meet the revenue targets, and they seem fairly modest revenue targets, not tax targets, and they keep to their promise of shrinking the expenditure GDP ratio, you're good. You'll have fiscal consolidation.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah. If you're not going to do anything, you shouldn't be spending money. Sure.
I'll get to not doing anything in a second, but Sanjeev Mehta, to take forward what we heard there from Rathin, and I want to now address the issue of consumption, because what we have seen, is that while the economy has been growing at 7.5%, 8%, etc., FMCG growth, volume growth, hasn't kept pace with the kind of growth that the GDP has seen. Now, on the back of many of the measures announced, as well as just the strength and the resilience that we have seen for the economy, do you expect that recovery to take shape?
Yeah. First is the FMCG volume has also been in sync with the private consumption growth, which has been about 4%. Now, FMCG growth happens when you have more money in the hands of more people. Yeah, it's not about concentrated wealth. Yeah, if it is spread out, that's when the FMCG consumption goes up. Now, if you look at the previous couple of years, if you go back to 23, we had massive inflation. So while the FMCG was growing at about 10-11%, bulk of the growth was coming from price growth.
Yeah.
Now we are talking about an era where the price growth has gone. In fact, in some quarters, you will see negative price growth. So most of the heavy lifting will have to come from volume growth. Yeah. And for volume growth, importantly, the structural issue that I talked about. Yeah. 60, 45, 17%. Yeah. Agri growing at 1.4%. Yeah, that doesn't help the cause. And giving doles, that's a band-aid. What India needs to do is create more jobs. What India needs to do is go up the value chain. That's the reason I said we need labor-intensive manufacturing and we need R&D and innovation ecosystem so that we go up the value chain. If you look at the thrusts, they're absolutely in the right direction. Will it happen overnight? No. The government is today prodding the private sector. Hey guys, we'll give you incentive. Employ more people. The employment happens when there is demand. Yeah. But the nudge, if you look at corporate balance sheets, they're pristine today. The debt equity is at 0.5 kind of thing. And today you have the capacity to invest. And normally what we do, you invest ahead of demand. Yeah. And if the private sector starts doing it, the incentives will act as a stimulus. That, okay, guys, EPF, part of it will give 1 month's wages in 3 installments. Now, those are going to be the triggers to people to look at more labor-intensive jobs. India needs that. But very importantly, we are not going to be in a scenario where a large number of people move out from agri sector because they're overemployed to other sectors. We have to increase the productivity of agriculture. And that is the reason the thrust, the first point of a 9-point charter is on agri. You have to bring in technology. You have to bring in FPOs. You have to revamp the cooperatives. 80% of the land area in India is less than 1 hectare. That does not lend itself to technology. So the thrust areas are again absolutely the right thing to be done.
Sanjay Nair, Zareen and Sanjeev, I want to get you to comment on what we just heard there from Sanjeev Mehta. The nudge that the government has tried to do by way of these sweeteners, by way of these incentives, both on internship as well as job creation. Sanjay Nair, I'll start by asking you, yes, corporate balance sheets have been repaired, corporate profitability significantly better, perhaps the best that we've seen in the last few years. Will this be enough now to spur industry, to trigger industry, to go out there, set up fresh capacity, add capacity, hire more people?
I think the large corporates will react because they are they have to react. That's why. But I think the real economy here is the MSMEs, and I think they react when there is demand and they have some pricing power, and they're not just price takers. So it takes time to trickle down the whole effect. And as I said in my portion earlier, this is going to be a long, arduous path to see consumption pick up, and is the right way because it'll be a much more sustainable thing. I think, Shereen, the key thing is going to be this concept of single window, whether it's for overseas or for local. If I want to set up an expansion of a factory, and we're talking of factories and real assets, not real estate, we're not talking of e-commerce, we're not talking of software. Life's got to be much simpler. And I think 6 months are more than enough because it's a very well-meaning government. They know what they have to do. They have a lot of feedback. I think the simplification of getting approvals to create real assets, to demolish 33 categories of TDSs, to have enormous number of GST complications. I mean, these can be changed very quickly. I think you do that, and I think you will find the private sector investing ahead, as Sanjeev said, ahead of consumption really picking up. Consumption, I think, unfortunately, will take longer to pick up. And I'm not averse to that because it'll be a sustainable consumption pickup when it happens, given the route they've taken, which is job creation, income creation, and then consumption, and not just a stimulus. So yeah, that's my only sort of comment on this. I think the jury is still out how we shape up. I don't think we should be just declaring complete victory because a lot of geopolitical risk.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, that's fair to say. But Zareen, I want to talk about the measures for MSMEs and SMEs in specific, the credit guarantee scheme that the government has put forward, as well as that self-financing corpus that's been put on the table as well. How significant is this likely to be, Zareen? And, from a banker's perspective, to say that you're SMA 1, but we would like some amount of flexibility to be provided to an SMA account, the guardrails that will need to be put in place.
Yeah. So, as we all know, MSMEs is about 30% of the GDP, and there are almost 6 crore MSMEs. If you look at the COVID experience, where ECLGS scheme was launched, about 20% of the MSMEs benefited from that. And the amount which was disbursed was 3.6 lakh crores. If you look at CTT MSC, which is also there where it gives government guarantee, we've already seen 1.5 lakh crore already being utilized. So these government guarantee schemes have been really, really effective in helping the MSME sector. In terms of going forward, I think government is quite encouraged by the experience of government guarantee and the kind of fillip that it is giving to the MSME sector. And only 20% of MSMEs are sort of taking loans from the formal sector. So there's a lot of scope for the other MSMEs to leverage the government guarantee scheme and take loans. In terms of SMA, if we see the fine print in Madam's speech, it says if the MSME is having distress beyond their control. So it's suppose there is a situation, which is a cyclical industry kind of situation. That's where the government feels that the MSME doesn't have any staying power, and the government wants to step in because at the end of the day, MSMEs, are the biggest job creators. There are 11 crore people employed by the MSME. The other thing that I just want to mention, besides MSMEs, the point that you made about jobs. If you look at CRISIL, they have said that the last 7 years, average private sector capex has been about 3.5 lakh crores. And that's expected next 7 years to be 6.9 lakh crores. It's a doubling that's going to happen of private sector. And this is CRISIL data. And for that kind of growth, you will have job creation happening. And at the same time, I think the government is addressing this whole issue of there's a demand and there's a supply, and how do you bridge that gap, and how do you have a 360 kind of solution in terms of skilling, getting employer incentivized, getting employee incentivized. So to my mind, it's a fairly comprehensive approach, and we've always talked of demographic dividend. To my mind, this is an approach to reap the demographic dividend.
Yes, that certainly is the intent. K.V. Subramaniam, the former Chief Economic Advisor, joins us now from Washington, D.C. Mr. Subramaniam, many thanks for joining us. It's been an early start for you, I would imagine, going over what the Finance Minister has delivered in Budget 2024. You were here with us during the course of the interim budget. So taking forward, I mean, the big message is continuity, both in terms of the fiscal arithmetic as well as in terms of policy from the interim budget. Your first take.
A very good morning, Shereen. Yes, it's been a late night for me watching the budget. I think as the first budget of the new government, I find it quite visionary. Apart from the emphasis on things like ease of doing business, especially I like the proposal to reform the tax code. This is something that I've been talking about for several years. The provision for angel tax, which will really help the entrepreneurial ecosystem, vision for the financial sector to support growth. I think the emphasis on employment and skilling is what really stands out for me in the budget. I think this is really unparalleled. I was involved in 4 budgets and having watched many budgets, this is something which is path-breaking. And importantly, this is based on schemes that have already worked very well. If you would recall, the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana during COVID, which had provided benefits, on the provident fund to the employer and employee less than 1,000, employees, that has actually done very well. About 60 lakh jobs where, new jobs where, those were either saved or created. So the incentives that have been now provided are redoubling of the same thing that has worked very well. At the same time, the ECGLS scheme, and the earlier commentator also talked about it very well. I think the ECGLS scheme has shown very clearly that guarantees help, because one of the things economists talk about is the problem of asymmetric information in MSMEs, because they oftentimes don't have as good data, and therefore credit creation does not happen as well to MSMEs, and guarantees can really help. We had done this during the COVID, and I think, again, something that worked very well. So overall, I look at this budget as a visionary one that will definitely help with employment creation. I just want to point out to make sure that narratives are actually, on employment is reflecting the reality. If you look at, using high quality data from CLEMS database, which is a worldwide database, and the PLFS, with the RBI report uses the CLEMS database. Even excluding agriculture jobs, 8.9 crore jobs have been created over the last 10 years, and that's a credible number coming from a very good database. So 89 lakh jobs on average have been created over the last, every year over the last 10 years. So the 80 lakh number that the economic survey has talked about is eminently achievable, especially given the incentives that have been provided through the employment-linked incentives. Last point, if we look at 80 lakhs, the number in and itself may seem very large. But if we take the base of the overall labor force, which is 60 crores, that is only 1.3%. And for a country like India, we need to actually, use the correct base to understand these numbers. Otherwise, they actually can lead to unnecessary fears or overblowing of the numbers. So overall, I think, the good job has been done on employment. Oftentimes the negative narratives actually preceded the reality. But doubling down on that, I think, is for me the most important aspect of this budget.
Well, job creation aspect, the most important. Where do you believe they needed to do more, Rathin, in context of your earlier comment that while they've been prudent, they haven't done enough?
Well, let me take them on their own terms. This was supposed to be, for the 3rd time in this government's lifetime, a long-term plan. Do you remember 2017? Niti Aayog came up with something. Everyone has chosen to forget all about it. 10-year strategy, 5-year vision, 3-year something. Again, and, every budget is a path-breaking budget in this country. These people have to be careful that the ED doesn't go after them. But again, after COVID, they said, okay, we are putting in a plan for the long term. Now, for the 3rd time, we plan for the long term. But I will continue to persevere and take them seriously. So they said that there are 4 focus groups. The only people who are not focus groups apparently are old men who don't work in farming. Women, the poor,
yes,
farmers, and the youth. Great. What have they got for women in the budget, concretely, in terms of Bahi Khata? Increase the number of working women's hostels. Now, with respect, that is something a panchayat or a municipality does. That is not something I expect Delhi Sultanate to do. You want more than that to happen. What have you got more than that? You've got lovely words, which a corporate PR agency could provide. Saturation. No numbers. We will saturate our schemes so that women have opportunities, etc., etc. Fine, we'll wait and see, but it's not enough for me. I expect budgets to be analytically more rigorous. Farmers. Now, I said to you, the third thing they've done, it's a political survival budget. What is the one thing this government has been terrified of? It's been terrified of farmers coming and trying to get into Delhi. We've seen that twice. What has that been about? That's been about MSP. What has the government done concretely in terms of rupees and paise? It's given an MSP. That is good. I'm not denying that that is good, but that is happening as a political response, and it's not an optimal response. The key constraints farmers have, which oddly enough, Van, the chief economic advisor, brought out in his economic survey yesterday, he was absolutely right. The key constraint farmers face is that this government and others, because they're in hock to the middle class, the rich middle class, when, say, potato or onion prices rise and the farmers have a chance to make some money for a change, they flood the country with imports or they impose export bans. I was expecting a commitment from this government not to do that. Of course, they haven't made such a commitment because they're worried about the middle class. It's heavily BJP voting. So that's also political. So this has not been addressed. So that's women, nothing. Farmers, except for political MSP, nothing. Youth. They have done something they've done very well. They've always done it well. They've borrowed from the opposition. They've picked up the Congress Party manifesto, apprenticeship employment plans. But the problem is that they have done it in a clumsy, disorganized fashion, and the math is all wrong. I'll just give you one example. They propose that the top 50 companies or something, each of them hire 4,000 people a year as interns. These companies don't even hire 4,000 people to work for them in regular jobs every year. That is not how organized companies work. They're extremely capital intensive. So the math will need to be done, and the math has not been done, and it's been sort of put there in a bureaucratic way. And finally, we come to the poor, or the poor. The poor have got, this was not mentioned in the budget speech, other than mentioning the poor once, Madam Finance Minister didn't use the word poor across the budget speech. It was all about the rich. But there is something in, if you look at the expenditure math. The 800 million rupee subsidy, the 800 people subsidy that we provide for people to eat. But what I expected from a long-term budget was, surely in a country where you're claiming that multidimensional poverty is down to single digits, we should not be required to give subsidy to 800 million people. So what is the plan to sunset this? How are people going to go out there and earn enough money to eat? So that we do not be in a situation where fifth largest country in the G20, Viksit Bharat, subsidizing 800 million people to eat. So in all these four counts, the government, in my view, has done nothing. Finally, when I said it's political, I've told you about agriculture. This is an NDA survival budget. The only place you actually, in the Bahi Khata, as the finance minister likes to call it, see rupees and paise in concrete terms is the money given to Andhra Pradesh, 25,000 crores plus, including something the World Bank must be very busy with, 15,000 crores as a loan, very soft loan, I'm sure, it's practically a grant, and 56,000 crores given to Bihar for central government public investment. Now, this is very good, and it's very, I think, strategic of Andhra Pradesh and Bihar not to have pushed this government for a special package and all that. They've taken the money. Why kill the goose that lays golden eggs? But they'll come back next year and the year after, and in the next election, any promise of a double-engine sarkar, when you're doling out special packages to your allies, are going to be very difficult to prove credible in Maharashtra, Haryana, and Jharkhand, and Haryana.
Well, those will be the political complexities that that the government will need to navigate. But KV Subramaniam, taking forward what we heard there from Rathin Roy, your take on the fact that in some areas, as Rathin is pointing out, perhaps more needed to be done, or do you want to contest Rathin's arguments on the budget map?
My friend Rathin was rejigging some memory, so let me rejig some memory for his benefit. I remember in 2019, in I think May or June, he talked about India being stuck in a middle-income trap. Rathin, I'm sure you remember that. And what have we got? After that, we've gotten growth at 7% plus. So I think it is important to sort of look at it in a far more balanced, manner. I think the viewers would have heard Rathin would actually see he's choosing to focus on all the aspects that are, that possibly need improvement. I'm not someone who actually will say that there, it's all, hunky-dory. There is actually definitely areas to work on. But at the same time, I will choose to highlight aspects that, are positive and where credit needs to be given. I think the fact is that indeed, India has emerged out of COVID despite the Ukraine war, with inflation that was much lower than the, that in the advanced economies, significantly higher growth despite the, the headwinds globally. And at the same time, job creation, I think the recent RBI report clearly shows. So as an economist, I think people like Ratin should also look at some of the aspects, that are positive and give a more balanced view.
Yes, and that's what we're attempting to do here on this program, get a diverse cross-section of views. But I am going to give closing comments, and I'll start with you, Mr. Subramaniam. Closing comments from you on the road ahead and what the expectation now is in terms of the announcements made, but what you would now like to see in terms of follow-through.
I think the first thing I would want to see is that the proposal for rewriting the income tax code, which the Honorable Finance Minister has mentioned 6 months. I think that is important. You would recall, Shereen, in 2019, there was a report, and I was a member of that, that the entire tax code has been rewritten with the number of provisions and the number of pages significantly decreasing. This is an important aspect of the ease of doing business because, whether it's individuals or corporates, for them, having a seamless and a very easy interaction with tax authority is a critical element. So given that our Income Tax Act is from 1961 and there's been a lot of patchwork amendments over the last 80 odd years, I think rewriting the direct tax code will really help in the ease of doing business and will also give more power to the faceless assessments that have been instituted. So that's an aspect that I want to see. At the same time, I think, some of the steps that have been taken on employment need to be followed up very clearly. I'm hoping that the labor law changes that were announced during the COVID time, states come together to implement the subordinate legislation. That was a very important piece of legislation for manufacturing sector growth. The industrial parks that have been talked about in this budget, those will fructify far better if the labor laws, the 4 codes are completely operationalized. So these are critical aspects that I think the angel tax removal of that is very important from the perspective of the startup ecosystem. I hope, startup ecosystem will take up. And I think finally, I want to mention that the private sector needs to step up further. I think, overall, private capex has improved very well. Some of those who actually said private capex has not happened, the data does not bear that. 19.8%. That's what the economic survey shows, in 2023. That's a growth. And Axis Research, which is what the survey points out, also similar growth in 2024. So, but I think there is still scope for investment to pick up, given that the dual balance sheet problem is actually a thing of the past. We should be aspiring to get to about 40% of GDP as investment, and private sector needs to step up more in that direction. So these are my expectations in the coming year.
Yes, and those are some of the expectations that the economic survey also pointed at. Sanjeev, I'm going to give you the final comment. Sanjeev Krishnan, and I'll come to Sanjeev Mehta then to close things out. Sanjeev, on balance from an investor perspective, an investment perspective, and especially on the capital gains side, the changes that have come about, do you believe that that's likely to sour the sentiment as far as the investment mood is concerned?
Not really. I don't think so. And I think, the way the markets landed at the end of the day sort of showed that. I think the markets have been giving enough and good returns, and we all pay taxes when we get good returns. So I think it's only fair. I do want to make one comment. I think, the whole piece on sustainability was something that I found was a little bit lacking. And I know that there was a mention of taxonomy for climate finance. I do believe that the growth has to be inclusive and sustainable both. And from that standpoint, today, and Shereen can say maybe, getting green financing even 5 to 10 bips lower is very hard. So I think how we can get that going in terms of execution of the plans and what has been said today will be critical. Inclusiveness and sustainability, those will be the key focus areas for execution from my standpoint.
The green transition roadmap also something that the finance minister spoke about, but that's a work in progress, so we'll wait to hear more. Ratin, very quickly.
Very quickly, I agree with Mr. Subramaniam. One should be balanced. So I already said it's a prudent budget, and the government, since he mentioned 2019, didn't do something silly like propose sovereign foreign borrowing, which was then shot down, mercifully. So they haven't done silly things. They've learned after Demon, after those, to not do silly things. And, you know, it is best to be modest when you have nothing much to do. So this government has been modest, and for that reason, there are many good things to say. The budget speech was short. The government has been modest about the fact that it's doing nothing. It hasn't tried anything silly. It's kept things prudent. That's fantastic.
Sanjeev Mehta, the closing comments with you.
Yeah, Shereen, there are two ends of the spectrum.
Yes.
Acute capitalism, which is unequal sharing of benefits. Acute socialism, which is equal sharing of miseries. I think what the government has gone about is what I would call as compassionate capitalism. Yeah. 20% after the COVID, the economy has grown, which is fabulous, best in class. But I have one request for you, Shereen. We, as Indians, put huge focus on the central budget. We never look at the state government's budget or the municipal corporation's budget. Can CNBC start?
We do. We look at state budgets.
As close a focus on the state government's budgets, because that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
We won't be able to grow unless we have a very clear strategies in each of the states of how they bring about competitive advantage for their states.
No, a point well taken, and we do, by the way, look at state budgets as well, and I agree with you that for us to be firing on all cylinders, we will need, because all the regulatory approvals, the ease of doing business, all of that is actually state-related, much more than it is center-related. So point well taken. Sanjay and I are completely out of time. Very quickly, final closing point.
I was just going to say the world is getting quite insular. It's not that global. I know it's not a budget topic, but the whole effort on FTAs to do corridor by corridor is extremely important. And we've got to tie up the FTAs with inviting capital and technology, whether it's China or not China, doesn't matter. But the way we are going about doing UK, EFTA, I think are very welcome. We got to be supercharged about it. We need the capital. We need the technology. We got to create the industrial zones. And we got to make it easy for these folks to come in here, manufacture in India, for India and for the world. I think it's critical. We've got to get more independent of this whole globality because, frankly, I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the global world at large. So we got to be pretty independent.
Well, that is a risk factor, the global uncertainty or the continued global uncertainty that we're faced with. But Sanjay Nair, Sanjeev Krishnan, Zareen Daruwala, KV Subramaniam, Sanjeev Mehta, Ratin Roy, many thanks for joining us here on the CNBC TV18 Budget Town Hall with your insights, not just on the announcements that have been made in the budget, but more importantly, what the road ahead looks like and what the unfinished agenda will need to factor in. Appreciate your time here. We will take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment with more.